You're listening to the ESO Network, your station for all things geek.
Welcome back to Modern Musicology. I hope you've got your earplugs in because we are going to turn it up to 11 this week. My name is Alan. I've got my co-host with me, Rob Levy.
Sup?
Stephanie Seymour.
Hello, everybody.
And look who's back with us, Anthony Williams.
Howdy.
Oh, man, I'm so glad you're back. I've missed you.
I'm happy to be back.
And we also have a really special guest that's joining us today. This is Mr. Tom Beaujour. He is the co-author editor of Nothin But a Good Time, the Uncensored History of 80s Hard Rock Explosion. Tom, how's it going?
Going very well. Going very well. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, man. Thank you so much for being with us. I was telling you before, I've been looking forward to this interview for months.
Yes.
I loved the book. I was a big fan of that scene at the time, so I can't wait to talk to you about it.
Awesome. Yeah, no pressure. Right? I'll try and live up to your expectations.
You will.
It's going to be great. That's all I'm going to say.
I want to just give people a little back history of you when you're not writing a New York Times bestseller. Tom is a producer, a mixer, guitarist, working out of his own studio called Nut House Recording. He's produced and mixed albums by Not a Surf, Guided by Voices, the Juliana Hatfield 3, and many, many, many others, and has either engineered, composed, produced, and or mixed music for a ton of TV shows, commercials, and films. He plays in the bands Eon Station and Painted Doll, and in the fictional band Side Boob, which appeared on 2 seasons of the Netflix series Orange is the New Black. And just as an aside, Tom and I know each other for like over 20 years when his band True Love was part of our Crop Duster Records family. So we're so happy to have you here, Tom. So just to sort of set up this whole book, we would love to know how you and your co-author, Richard, came to write this book and how you went about what must have been like a crazy, laborious process of interviewing so many people and just weaving this story into a cohesive unit, because there seems to be so many threads that you could have gone with. So how did this all come about?
Rich and I have known each other since the mid-90s. I'm a couple of years older than him, but I was the managing editor of Guitar World magazine, and he started working as an intern there. And we were both sort of starting out there, and it was an era where you couldn't talk about this stuff and you couldn't cover this stuff. So because it was just like it had been erased, even though Guitar World had a few years earlier had Vito Bratta on the cover and Reb Beach from Winger and stuff. Like by 1994, when I started there, it was as if none of that had ever occurred.
Wow.
It was Soundgarden on the cover. It was presidents of the United States. And so neither of us in sort of our earlier years got to ever talk to any of our sort of heroes from that era because they had been canceled completely. And so we kind of discovered that we both were similarly addled by this music. And it sort of became something that we discussed on and off for years. And then eventually when I was the editor of Guitar Aficionado magazine, Rich was my executive editor, and we would talk about this stuff all the time. And I think that was probably the first time that I said, somebody's got to do this book. Like somebody's got to do this. And we sort of talked about it casually. And then I left magazines in 2013 and was doing the studio full time.
Yeah.
And honestly, I kind of been thinking about it, and people have been like, dude, you got to do that book. You got to do that book. And then I was recording Paul Stanley's son's band, and they're actually really good. They kind of sounded like Joe Jackson or something, but I mixed the stuff and I thought it sounded really good. And then they didn't, and they fired me. And I was kind of like, Actually, I think they never really ended up putting out anything. But I busted my ass because they were supposed to get it done so they could press CDs for the Kiss cruise, and because they were going to go play on the Kiss cruise. The day that they were like, "Oh, we're not going to use this stuff," and apparently Paul Stanley said it didn't sound like they sounded live. But anyway, literally that day, I was like, "Fuck this! I can't have my entire life be at the mercy of bands that I'm recording." It's too precarious, not even financially, just like psychically. Yeah. And so I was like, I'm doing it. And I called Rich and I was like, dude, do you want to do it? And he was like, yes.
Wow.
And then I said, okay, there's only one condition. And he's like, what? I'm like, my name goes first. And he's like, fuck you. So we started it. Then we had to write, a couple chapters and a full-on proposal. Luckily, a friend of ours, actually who used to play in Kevin Salem's band, this guy David Dunton, he's our literary agent, and so we had an agent, which is probably the most impossible thing to do. Like that's the hardest, and so that was in place, and. We started interviewing people, and I think I'm answering your question. You can totally start. No,
you are.
But we started working on it, and we didn't have a deal. I had 10 years as the editor of Revolver under my belt, so I don't think I really ever screwed anyone over. So I had contacts and a reputation, and
so
Rich.
That's how you got all the people to interview.
That's how we got people when we didn't have a deal.
I gotcha.
We got about 30 people just through JJ French from Twisted Sister and a couple other people. I knew people who knew them, and Rich Rich is a freelance writer, so he's always working for Guitar World and stuff. So we knew who to call to get enough people to put together a couple of chapters. And then actually nobody wanted it.
Really?
Everybody passed on the book, except for St. Martin's. He was the one guy.
I guess they're all kicking themselves in the ass right now, pretty much.
I guess, maybe. I hope so. But Mark Resnick was a kid who grew up on Long Island and was really into Twisted Sister, and he was like, let's do it. And then we got started in earnest, and it was still another 2.5 years of interviewing people. So to answer your next question, first of all, I don't know how anyone does these alone. I don't know how Lizzie Goodman wrote Meet Me in the Bathroom alone. I seriously don't know how one could do it because, we ended up interviewing, I think 125 people. That's about right. And the sheer logistics of it, the scheduling around the rest of your life. I don't know if you couldn't punt once in a while and be like, Rich, can you take this? Or can you, I don't know how you would do it, but we worked for a couple years doing interviews, and the way that we then ended up finishing it was, we follow about 10 bands. This is the answer to your, I think, last part of your question. The book follows Skid Row, Warrant, Guns N' Roses, White Lion. There's about 6 to 10 bands whose stories go from beginning till the end, or beginning till when they get signed. And we wrote them all the way through. So that's how we had these strands of we had 5, 6, 7 band stories that went all the way from beginning to end. And then I flew out to Boulder where Rich lives, and we literally sat there for 2 days straight, chopping up the strands. And being like, all right, so White Lion, Mike Tramp meeting Vito goes into this, and then they will do that. And that's how we did it.
Wow.
I don't know how, there's probably another way to do it, but we just wrote the bands all the
whole
way
stories. And then, and then you basically sort of interwove, is that a word?
Yeah.
Everybody else into those stories. I mean, as the, timing coincided, or
we tried to slice it up as chronologically as possible so that you're bouncing around between these different bands. But I guess you could choose. This was an idea that I floated, but I got shot down on. I wanted to put a choose your own story thing at the bottom of each thing. So it's like, if you would just want to keep
Hilarious.
reading about White Lion, go to page. That was not approved.
I love that though.
By
But,
your
you know,
co-author or by your editor?
I don't think Rich was super into it, but Mark, our editor, who is like really cool, he was just like, no.
Oh.
The last thing is we went in to talk to Dave Dunn, our agent, and we hadn't decided what format the book was going to be. You know, we were thinking maybe oral history, but we just weren't sure. We were like, is that copping out? Blah, blah, blah. And we walked into his office and he was like, you're doing an oral history, right? And we're like, yeah. So, and I'm really glad he did that, because I think it would not have at all been as good a book, like as engaging, if we had not done it this way.
Yeah. One of the things that I really love about the book is sort of getting to learn some of the really early stories about, a lot of these bands we know from, the time of their first record. And I'm thinking of like Guns N' Roses and Motley. You think of them in terms of that lineup, that you see on that first album, their classic, quote unquote, classic lineup. But what I enjoyed most about the book was reading stories about these bands before getting signed, like when they were still kind of like just on the scene and just like starting to play clubs and stuff, and who almost ended up in some of these bands, like Slash almost being in Poison. And it's fun to think about how some of these bands would have been very, very different had some of those things happened and not changed the way we know them as today.
I think first of all, I think we really sort of focused on the earlier stuff because the specificities of that are really more interesting than, like, once a band goes out on the road, like, there's nothing to remember. Like, unless somebody like dies, or there's a fire, or you get arrested. I mean,
Seriously.
there's no way. Like, I mean, like, if you asked me about a tour I did in 1997, I can't tell you, like, oh yeah, and then on the third day, was Cincinnati and we ate it. Like, and that was like a week-long tour, but it just becomes a blur. So these guys, they get their record deal and then they get stuffed in a metal tube called a tour bus, and then they really have very similar existences. And so that wasn't really where, we wanted to, like, if something specific happened at a certain concert, we wanted to cover it. But the touring just becomes, repetitive. It's really the early days where you learn and understand these bands, like whether it's the LA bands that couldn't get arrested because, it wasn't cool, or Kicks, just playing millions of cover shows in Maryland. And the thing also with Slash auditioning for Poison is you really see how committed and, also ruthless these people were. Like, and also how in a rush they were. There's like one line where I think it's one of the guys in Warrant was like, I was freaking out because we weren't signed. I was getting old. I was 24.
Oh, yeah.
These were people. They really didn't have like an escape thing. They weren't like, they hadn't gone to college, and then they really wanted to succeed. And if they were in a band and there was somebody who didn't look right or didn't play right, they nuked them.
Yeah.
And kept going. Like, when Tom Kiefer has to fire half his band to get a deal with Mercury, I mean, it's not an easy decision, but that's the kind of things, these people did. And it's funny because there's a box set that just came out on that label, the Numero Group, which does like all these cool, weird, like esoteric box sets. And they did one on Sunset Strip bands that didn't make it.
Oh,
yes.
And some of them have, people in them that like Ron Keel and people who ended up in successful bands. But when you listen to those bands or look at the pictures, there's always something a little off. You can see like, oh, that's why that band. Mm-hmm. You didn't look at the picture like you look at a picture of Poison and Guns N' Roses, and like you're saying, it seemed like these things were created like from, that they descended from a spaceship, and like, here it is, and these are the characters in the movie, or the characters. And it's in all of the bands that made it, there was even if the guys hated each other, there was a chemistry and a look and a sound, and there was this musical chairs thing happening, particularly in LA, where probably, there's 200 people on that scene. And they're like, Warren D. Martini's in Dokken for a second, and Jakey Lee's in Ratt, and it's moving so fast. You really, when you think about it, it's probably like 5 weeks.
Right.
Yeah. But it's also like the people who couldn't, like you were saying, people are just wanted to deal so bad. Like one example that comes to mind was Kip Winger. I mean, and he even said he was damaged goods because he had tried so many times to send demos for so long, trying to get signed. And like he had to change the name of the band to State of Emergency. They got the demo to Atlantic. The guy didn't know he was listening to Kip Winger. He like signed him. And then he was like, oh, shit, I just signed Kip Winger. So it's like the desperation and it's also, I have to say, it's admirable. They just kept trying. They kept trying and trying and trying until they got it,
Tom, it was interesting to me what you just said about the bands that didn't make it, not quite looking right. And when I was a teenager and I really grew up in the early 2000s, I was a serious metalhead. I was in school in England and it was Iron Maiden, Judas Priest. It was the classic metal stuff. And at the time, and my opinion has changed as I've got older, I fucking hated this scene. And I think because everything was so stylized.
Yes.
It gave the impression of being very overproduced and commercial that for 15-year-old me was the antithesis of everything I knew and loved at the time and everything I loved about the metal scene. But in reading the book, it comes across as being far more organic than that. It's not manufactured in the same way that, you see in the pop industry. And that was hugely eye-opening in reading the book and helped me gain an appreciation of these bands that I despised for all the wrong reasons when I was 16.
But there is an element of some of that you're talking about, because if Motley Crue gets signed, then half the bands on the scene try to look like Motley Crue.
That's true.
But that is of every.
Sure.
Like people were dressing like REM and people were dressing like Elvis Scott, So I think that the mimetic quality, that's just part of like pop culture. But I do think that's one of the things that Rich and I actually learned. Like my experience of this genre of music is being a kid watching MTV and these things, appeared and you're like, oh, here it is. Def Leppard, and neither of us really understood this thing that had happened where Van Halen gets signed in 1977 and then nobody gets signed for 5 years. And that all of these bands then really created a DIY scene.
Yeah.
When you really think about what these bands did with no help from the major labels who had no interest in them, WASP, in the book, we talk about how, they had a friend who worked at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, and that's where they stole stuff to make their pyro. And that they were using gas grills in the Troubadour to shoot flames.
Yes.
And going to buy raw meat to throw at the audience. And, that was not done like with Capitol Records giving them money. These were like, this was just pure insanity, happening off the grid in a weird way.
I loved all of those stories of that, just like passionate ingenuity. Like, what can we do to be different from everybody else? I just found all that stuff really exciting to read about.
It's, and the thing is, like, Nikki Sixx, I've interviewed him a couple times. That dude is smart. I mean, he, everybody says like, oh, he knew everything from the beginning. When you talk to Lita Ford about, she was dating Nikki Sixx very early on. She's like, he knew like what the albums were going to be called. This guy had a real plan. And I think for these bands, the strategy and the promotion was as important on some levels as the music. That said, like we were saying earlier, the streets of LA were littered with bands who worked as hard but weren't good. Yeah. And just didn't make it. But yeah, that period where these guys like can't get record deals until Quiet Riot comes out, I had no idea that like that there had been this sort of like completely fallow period for 3 or 4 years, and neither did Rich.
I mean, I think that there's like, I was thinking about this because there was so much like of a DIY aspect of that, just like there was for the punk scene. And like, I remember, being at Danceteria and just seeing like a Hanoi Rocks video or like a Motley Crue video for Looks a Kill or whatever. And just, I was totally into punk and new wave and goth at that time, but like everyone was sort of drawn to that new kind of like metalish, but kind of mixed with androgyny, a little bit of punk, and it sort of all just kind of came together, in a very organic way. I mean, I remember all the girls started really digging the heavy metal dudes because they had that, tough kind of thing. But then they were like, yeah, I'm going to add a little eyeliner with it. But that was cool because so did the goth guys, you know what I mean? Like, and it was just like an organic way of the whole thing, just like kind of punk did, I feel like.
And like, especially in the beginning, like Nikki's, like going back to Nikki Sixx, like he knew, like I've jokingly said, like there's two kinds of hair metal bands, the ones who knew about the New York Dolls and the ones who didn't. But, like, and he knew about the Dolls and about British glam and about punk rock. And all of those elements were deliberately put into the thing. Like there's a reason why, I mean, Mick Mars is a great guitar player. He's not like a virtuoso, he's like this great rhythm guitar player. And I think like they put together this thing that could sort of like skew in different directions, where punk people liked him and the metal people liked him. And and I think probably to your point of finding this music to be horrifying, the beginning was much gnarlier, gothier, more dangerous than sort of what it morphed into.
Right. Cherry Pie. Right.
Yeah. Which I love that song, but still.
But yeah.
but yeah, it kind of took a turn, I think maybe after Poison,
Yeah. And I've got to say, Tom, that whole piece in the book about Blackie throwing meat into the audience and nearly burning the troubadour down, I was cackling my ass off. And my girlfriend was like, what? And I was like, if I told you, you would just not believe a word of this. You're going to have to read this yourself.
I mean, it's really, there's some of stuff in there that's fucked up. Like when Chris Holmes was like, oh, and then this woman reached up towards me and she got stuck on my like giant fishing hook shark thing,
Right.
Like, but that's really what they were using. They were using like completely bizarre things and repurposing them for their wardrobe and for their
And certainly, and I don't mean to talk for too much about WASP, so I'm going to keep this brief and then I'm going to shut the fuck up about WASP. Obviously, I love them. But, firstly, you mentioned the Dolls, and Blackie was in the Dolls for about 2 minutes at the very end of their time. And second, you talked about Nikki Sixx being fiercely intelligent. I think Blackie is up there as well. I think he was still is a very smart dude, but he wasn't quite able to play the game quite as well as the guys in Motley Crue, maybe.
He might not have written, I mean, Wasp was really good, but like I don't think he wrote the songs that were necessary to actually move it into the pop world a little bit. But
yeah, you have something like Wild Child, which works on that level, but then that's one song on an entire album, whereas Motley Crue have an entire album of that kind of song.
My co-author is a WASP fanatic, and he chased Blackie for this book like it was his Moby Dick. Like for like 3, we ended up like finding somebody who had interviewed Blackie. I mean, not to reveal too much how the sausage gets made, but we couldn't. He just wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. Like, and Rich, I think he just couldn't let go. He's like, I need to talk to Blackie. Like it was irrelevant really whether it was necessary. Like, and that was his major disappointment.
Yeah,
I think was not getting Blackie.
I think all of us have that one or two figures in our head that it's not a complete story unless we get that person.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, Tom, is there anyone that you personally regret not being able to speak to for the book?
CeCe DeVille.
Oh yeah. All the Poison guys were involved except for CeCe.
Yeah, Ricky was involved. Brett, gave us the cover blurb and everything, and he was involved. Yeah. CeCe DeVille is like my spirit animal. I love him. My favorite band of all time is Cheap Trick, who I've seen like 50 times. And to me, there's like this direct line from like Rick Nielsen to CC DeVille. And when I saw the Talk to Me video for the first time, like, I guess I was in 10th grade. No, I was in 9th grade. And that opening shot where CC DeVille is next to the, truck, and he's got his guitars lined up on stands, and he's playing, and he's got the top hat, and he like throws the guitar, and like that. When I saw that, I'm getting animated. That was like, I was like, that's everything that I want to be, except that I kind of also wanted to be like Bob Mould, but that was the aspirational thing, like all those guitars, like the awesome hair, like he was truly and still is this like figure, like the idea of him is like this, just this thing that I adore. And I would have loved to talk to him. I completely understand why he didn't want to talk to us, but I would have loved to talk to him. He's been brutalized by the press. I remember Guitar World did like a worst guitar solos of all time story. And like, it was like 1 to 5 CC DeVille heads.
Oh, Jesus.
But he was really the one person who I would have absolutely loved to talk to for this. But a lot of the other people I did get to talk to, I wanted to, like Vito Bratta from White Lion was sort of like the guy I really wanted to talk to, because he's been on, he's just doesn't surface, and I got to do that. So, but yeah, CC for me, Blackie for Rich. Those were the great heartbreakers.
I just kind of talking about CC and how he was been brutalized by the press. I mean, I had another thing that I was thinking about was that the whole scene kind of was, as you said, it was almost like a pariah to even think about or talk about for ages. There's an impression that a lot of these people could not play, but really so many of them could. And so many of them were so talented, like, I'll say Kip Winger again, because I have a lot of Kip Winger examples, but I mean, he was like a classically trained, player. And all the Vixen women were, I think it was it Roxy? No, it was Cher, right? Who was a session player for like Helen Reddy and stuff. I mean, so I don't think the genre has really gotten its due, but do you think it ever will, or will it just be sort of what's its,
No, because I think it's kind of gotten its due now, in that there was the Dirt movie, and without sounding like an asshole, like our book came out and did well. Like, so I think kids really know about it. Like they watch it on YouTube, but there are sort of structural problems with this music. Like when we were trying to come up with a title, and ultimately, again, our agent Dave Dunn was like, "You're going to call it Nothing But a Good Time, right?" And we're like, that's so obvious. He's like, "Yeah, you're going to call it Nothing But a Good Time, right?" But I looked through dozens of albums worth of lyrics to try and find something else. Yeah. And it's appalling. Like, it's like really, I can't sit here. I can tell you I love this music, and the guitar players were amazing. The guitar players completely shaped my whole life. But like the lyrics, like in general, there's some exceptions. Oddly, like Janie Lane's lyrics are actually good in Warrant, but like the lyrics are generally terrible. And so I understand why the mainstream media at the time, like the Rolling Stone world and the daily newspaper writers, like serious music journalists, were like, no way.
Right.
I'm
so
not
you
covering
didn't want
this.
to call the book She's Only 17.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. So but there are a lot of reasons why this stuff wasn't taken seriously, and that like are not false, But so I don't think it will ever sort of receive the critical kudos. It's not going to be like suddenly this is as important as Sonic Youth. Like, I don't think like rock, like most rock critics and like people I know, they really just think this stuff sucks. Like it's and I think part of the reason I like this music so much is like I went to school. I grew up in New York City, and I went to this prep school in the city, and like literally whereas the rest of America, probably this was like the music that like people were listening to. Like nobody listened to this stuff. So it was like a real way for me to like create an identity and be the guitar kid and like sort of, if you're not a jock, then you have to create sort of like some acceptable way to be viewed as someone who's like an interesting, like pet, you know what I mean? Like whatever. So that was my thing. And this music, it's almost like for me has always been defiant. Like my love of it and like my defending of it and writing a book about it is like a defiant thing and like a fuck you to like all of the, journalists who I've talked to over the years who are like, like, well, how can you like that stuff? And it's a real, it's like probably people who like really bad B horror movies, but like, I love this stuff and I listen to Hair Nation all the time.
Yeah.
Rich is the same way. And I think that that's why this thing came off well, is that we were doing it from a real position of like fanhood and wanting to like create something that like honored this music. And there was no, like, we still get on the phone after going through this whole thing and we'll be talking about this stuff.
Yeah. I think it comes across that way. Like it really does, like you're a genuine love of it.
Yeah. But I'm also aware and will not try, I'm not ever going to like sit here and have a debate about the quality of I know what the shortcomings are.
Yeah.
I'm not like, what? Yeah.
So, Tom, I think it's interesting that this music comes along. It has a scene, much like we talked about with punk. It's got this festering movement going on. It's got its own community, its own spirit. It's got its own way of working, right? Then it sort of expands beyond Headbangers Ball, kind of, and goes mainstream with a lot of these bands getting broken on radio. And then it kind of gets shoved aside when the guys that sort of propped up all these metal bands and were putting them out on every time you turned around, there was one coming out on the labels. It's almost like the labels just suddenly like threw their hands up, pushed them aside, and then found all the indie bands that started in college radio and sparked that whole phase where we had sort of like the cool indie rock, alternative rock thing. And then when grunge happened, the great thing about grunge is that a lot of people would listen to grunge and say, I want more, and they'd go back and discover some of these bands. Now, it was not necessarily the renaissance that you would want, but I think that was sort of a really good time for sort of looking at a lot of these really interesting ones in circumspect. And I'm just wondering if you can kind of talk about how a lot of this scene got sort of strip mined. It was really horrible, having talked to a couple people in some of these bands once in a while, and they always talked about how they just felt like the label gave up on them. That's like a recurring theme that I always hear, and they were moving on to REM and Sonic Youth and other things.
I mean, the thing is that those like Sonic Youth and REM, well, REM is I think almost like an outlier because they were so big, but there was that college radio, the college rock department at every label, like Soul Asylum was kicking around on A&M, and Sonic Youth were, I think, signed to Geffen long before Nevermind came out. And Dinosaur had been signed, I think, and so there were a lot of the Husker Du was on Warner Brothers, and they'd all kind of failed, but there was already a recognition of this stuff. I think what happened really was a couple of things. The music definitely, it had a really good run. Yeah. As these things go, like if you want to say, from Come On Feel the Noise to when Nevermind comes out, like it's 9 years of like these bands doing really well. Which is, that's a really good run. And it had gotten to the point where the kids who were like 20 and starting the new, like the last wave of the bands, they were Motley Crue fans, so the first wave of the sort of hair metal bands were guys who grew up on like Aerosmith and Van Halen and Priest and, probably Kansas and Foghat or whatever. By the time you get to the end of the era, it's guys who grew up on Motley Crue and Poison and Quiet Riot. And I think it really did become sort of, like you're saying, this thing where they were just cranking these bands out one after the other.
I always think of the Melvins because like the Melvins are a band that you listen to, and or even the Dwarves, they are so rooted in metal that it's like you can tell they listen to a lot of the stuff, right?
I think they listen to metal. I don't think they listen it's like Kurt Cobain was really into Venom. The weird thing about this music is that when it disappeared completely and almost instantaneously.
Yeah.
And like that does not generally happen where
like the dinosaur extinction.
Yeah, it was like insane. And there's a story in our book where Brian Forsyth from Kix, and first of all, I love Kix, and he was like one of the greatest people to interview in the book. But he's talking about how like 92, 93, he somehow scores an audition with the Wallflowers. And he's a great guitar player, and Kix had a number 9 top Billboard single and a platinum record. Like that's something to be proud of. And he goes into the audition and like he doesn't even mention it that he was in Kix, because that would be like a non-starter. Same with Cher from Vixen. She's like, I did not mention that I had been in Vixen for like 10 years after this thing. It really became
pariah,
like
Bill.
Yeah, you were, and it was like a shameful thing to have been involved in it. The A&R people got fired. The producers who had been making these records couldn't work again. Like none of the new bands wanted to be associated with it, even if they were like Candlebox was not going to be like, let me use Beau Hill, who did the Ratt records. They were like, no, I want, it was truly like a thing that was completely
it was a race,
uncool.
Basically.
Yeah, it was a race. And like, but the thing, so I'm getting to your question. See, because I think that like,
that's good.
One of the very interesting things that Kim Thale said in our book, because we interviewed him, and he's like, it really bums me out that people think that I wanted to be successful to destroy somebody else.
That was that was so a very nice thing to say, I think, And
it's like he was into some of these bands. Mike McCready from Pearl Jam is like a total metal guy. Like he's a shredder. Yeah. Alice in Chains were basically a glammy band. So there was definitely some of these people, and even like Mother Love Bone is really kind of this stuff too. There were these bands that were sort of like glam metal adjacent, and also in LA, the bands that were coming out of the Scream Club versus like the Sunset Strip,
like even Jane's Addiction kind of was not, whatever, but
and like Junkyard and like, they were all kind of like, and I'm sure the Nymphs played some show with like, Guns N' Roses, but I think Nirvana's different. I think that, and I think people thought like, Kurt Cobain became sort of the shining light on top of the mountain for like this whole thing. And he was violently anti-glam metal.
Yes.
He was like zero tolerance, because he had zero tolerance for sexism, for homophobia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But he was just like, this shit is terrible. And he made it known. And so it's like Kurt Cobain says this stuff is bullshit. And it's bad. Not only is it bullshit, but it's bad. And Kurt was totally not, he was into Venom, but like he came out of like the Melvins and he was into, the Vaselines is like, they're insane. Like he was really into strange music. And so I think that his aesthetic really made it difficult for people to hang on to the other thing. It's not just him, but I think that he was part of a line drawn in the sand, and where it was just like, well, it's a binary decision,
It's interesting because I know a lot of people that love metal that like, okay, I'm not doing Nirvana, but they really loved Mother Love Bone, Alice in Chains, and Soundgarden. It's very interesting how the sides sort of gotten taken. I wanted to ask you as well how much of an influence you think the PMRC had in this sort of style of music going away or being misperceived by the public.
I know like D went down there. I don't think, because look, given that gangster rap like emerged like immediately at the same time, I don't think that did as much as the sort of changing attitudes. Like people are like, well, hair metal's sexist, but like, yes, but if you look what's going on at the time of like 1983, 1984,
Yeah.
like Porky's is coming out.
Yeah.
You know, Zapped
just
with Scott
times.
Baio and Heather Thomas. Like,
I mean,
every kid in America, like boy in America, I mean, not everyone, but had those Heather Thomas posters.
Yeah, it was. We were talking about this in another podcast. I mean, it was like just the times. It was what it was.
And I am intrigued by just how much it got ghosted. It's like nothing I've ever seen as someone who listens to music. I've just never seen anything just go away like this, and that's what really sort of disturbs me about it.
That's why we wanted to do the book too, because I've been like, my first idea for the book, you know, and I abandoned it quickly, but was to call it Into Thin Hair and like just focus on.
That's the second one.
Yeah.
I love it.
I was literally just going to do a whole book about like what happened between 1991 and 1994.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Awesome.
But that would have been, but it would have been a super bummer.
Right.
But yeah, it was really intense. It was, again, like when I was working at the Guitar Magazine, like we did not cover, like you might get like if Red Beach from Winger put out a record, he might get like a tiny record review.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But it was just like this, no.
But it was a kind of a mixture of things, right? I mean, it was that scene with grunge or whatever, and you can kind of blame that, but it was also just a changing of the guards anyway. Like I think there was that Ozzy was saying that he was saying to Sharon, like, this is going to last forever. And she was like, wait until 1990. And she probably didn't really realize how prophetic that was at the time. But
yeah,
it was also video, like, you know, the Beavis and Butthead stuff, making fun of, you know, everything. But it was also a complete oversaturation of, I remember watching MTV at that time and just being like, if I see one more girl with a bikini with, you know, like, and not even in a sexual, like that it was just that it was so boring and overdone. Like I was just done with it.
What year, when were you on Mercury?
My band?
Yeah.
No, we were on Network IRS. It was 1989 and we got signed, and then in 90 was when our record came out.
So how much, like in your, I'm sorry, but I'm really curious, like when you were in that world of the industry then, like were you just so tired of these? Oh, you worked, right? I
mean, I was working at Island since 1986. So.
Did you work the Vane record?
I did. Yes, I did. As a matter of fact. I think that it was, you know, I clearly remember I was just also talking about this on another podcast. Recently our podcast with, was sitting in my office and listening to Nirvana and just thinking like, this is mind blowing and this is where it's going. But on a personal level, thinking that I'm so sick of this, you know, stuff, like I just said, but I think that the mindset in the industry was shifting too. And when you said that people were getting fired left and right, it's so true. I mean, people, the A&R reps that were signing that, the producers were not getting any work, you know, the studios, you know, just from the top to the bottom, it was like, ping, goodbye. It was a very, very fast turnover.
I think what's particularly interesting about that time is it wasn't just the hair metal scene that suffered. It was the entire heavy metal scene.
Yeah.
I mean, bands like Iron Maiden and Judas Priest, who I think of as more traditional metal, went from playing stadiums and arenas to playing, you know, relatively small theaters. It seems like hair metal suffered the most, and that was, as it was put earlier, almost an extinction level event, but everything else also seemed to go massively into abeyance. So I don't think it was just the image, but something about the sound just, I don't know, maybe it just reached that point of its life where after 10 good years, it's time for a change.
No, and I mean, look, I went to see the stadium tour this summer with Motley Crue, but like nothing ever bounces back. You know, like you get one shot to be the music of a 16 to 18-year-old, right? Like that's just how it works. Like I am into. It's not like a coincidence that I'm like into Poison and Husker Du and the Replacements. Like I know it's a weird combination, but like that is because that went in my brain when I was 16,
Yes.
and like my prefrontal lobes weren't formed. And you'll find bands that you love later in life, but I think that there's really something about that music that it stays with you. And so like, that moves on.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It happens to everyone,
It does.
but like, again, that doesn't change the fact that this music was disappeared. Like it was like Roanoke, it was just like, where are they?
Yeah. No, it was definitely more extreme than other genres, that's for sure. But
it couldn't exist in the 90s, I don't think.
Yeah.
And I think a big part of that is even now, you can't just rely on nostalgia to bring something back to its former glory. You have to bring in a new audience. And audiences these days, particularly younger audiences, are not that interested in guitar-based music, at least not as much as 30, 40 years ago.
Yeah.
If you read Stephen Wilson's autobiography, that's something he talks about. And he says until someone comes in and does something new and interesting with the guitar again, that's just going to be the case. It's going to be urban music that's going to continue to dominate for the next 10 or so years.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably true. But it did, they did get to come back and work. That is the one good thing. And it's like whenever I work with young people, when I'm saying young, I'm like under 30, their level of music omnivorousness is completely bizarre to me because they've been able to hear everything. Like they'll be like, oh yeah, Skid Row, Youth Gone Wild. And then they'll be like talking about like the Cardigans or like, it's just weird. Like I think it now just exists in this mush of the past. But I mean, when you go look on YouTube at like the Talk Dirty Me video, somebody's watching it because it's just like millions and millions. And I think it can't all be,
us.
60-year-olds. Yeah, us. They did like these bands are getting to, not in a always glamorous way, but getting to work. And it's not like an easy like Cher Ross from Vixen. Do you know why she left Vixen recently? It's because she's a realtor in Florida. And so she would be playing Friday, Saturday nights with Vixen and then have to get back to Florida for showings on Sundays. Because that's the day. So like, and she did it for a while and she's like, I'm going to die.
Wow.
But like, so these people.
Yes. I mean, we mature and grow and, you have a job that, it's hard to go out on the road and play gigs and fly back and get up the next morning. I mean, just is.
One of the things that you mentioned, like bands like Kansas earlier, one of the things that I kind of want to talk about a little bit is the legacy bands that sort of reinvented themselves to fit in with this 80s rock scene. The two big examples that I was thinking of are Alice and Kiss, because both of them were hugely inspirational for a lot of these bands, both musically and visually. And then there comes a point where they are having to compete on the same scene. Before we started recording, Anthony mentioned Dio, and I think that applies to Ronnie as well. That these are bands that had an influence on who it was that came after them, and then they find themselves on the same basketball court, basically trying to play a game, and and the way that they reinvented themselves to fit in with that. I think that's a really interesting subject.
It totally is. And, it's funny, even some of the bands who, like Quiet Riot, actually reinvented themselves from being like a 70s, like glam band, But actually, Gene Simmons turned us down for this book. He said, you're only as good as the company you keep. That was his answer. But it is interesting, like, and Priest too, they had that song Parental Guidance, which was like this really pop metal song. And they're trying to
the whole Turbo album.
Yeah.
Some of them did hold on. I don't feel like Dio really managed to really bob and weave his way into it, but Alice Cooper did, and he did it by
he did. Yeah.
Hiring, he was like, I'm going to hire the guy. I'm going to hire Desmond Child. I'm going to hire the guy who wrote the Bon Jovi hits. It's weird. There are not many things that drive me crazy, but knowing that Alice Cooper is an intelligent man and that the lyrics to his hit are "Your lips are venomous." This bothers me every time I hear it. Your lips are venomous poison. Yes.
Yes.
That you can't, you know what I mean? And I'm just like, Alice Cooper just fucking really was like, all right, I'll do whatever they want. I'll do whatever they want. You want me to sing this? This is okay. He did manage to do it, but I think it was really that he had these songs that were made, like he just plugged himself into the formula. And he did it very successfully. He'd been sort of down and out, like Constrictor and like that other one. Like there was a couple records that just sucked and nobody really even knew they came out when Kip Winger was in his band.
Yeah.
There was kind of a sense like when those singles came out, at least for me, like I kind of wasn't hip to everything else he had done. Like, oh, this dude's a little old, but this song's catchy. So he really did it very, very successfully, but very shrewdly. Like, I don't know who his A&R guy was. Same with Aerosmith, who are
that's true.
Yes.
The most hugely successful.
What a comeback. I mean, I say comeback, but yeah. What a reinvention, I guess.
Yeah, and like John, they came back right during this stuff, and they just like
Heart.
Heart
kind of did too. Heart had a sort of reinvention of this kind of this whole scene.
Yeah, and Ozzy too. Went sort of the glam rock route for a little while,
but then he got Zach.
But
no, he did. I mean, he made it through the '80s, and but he also Ozzy is like, I don't know what he's like. It's like if you don't like Ozzy or the Taliban. Like, I don't know. Like, I don't know how, there's something about him that is so, I think in a weird way he deserved it, but he was playing theaters too. But yeah. Some of the bands managed to do it. Kiss managed to do it too, also by hiring songwriters.
Oh yeah. And Desmond Child was one of theirs too.
Yeah. But they struggled, but it's funny. This stuff got cut out. Because we didn't end up getting to talk to him, and I can't remember his name, but I was talking to an executive from Mercury Records, and like when they fired Ace and Peter, I mean, the guys were totally wasted, but they also knew that they needed like 80s horsepower.
Yeah.
We need people who can play in this new way. And they did. They changed their sound and became, funnily enough, followers.
They did.
Everyone probably in Motley Crue, Ratt, you name it, probably at some point dressed up as a member of Kiss for Halloween.
Oh yes, 100%.
And then Kiss comes out with Animalize and they're dressing like Ratt.
Right.
Right. Tables have turned.
Yeah, they were always sort of on the back foot throughout that whole decade. And I love the stuff that they did, but it was always like a year later than it should have been.
Yeah. And they were, and like Gene also was like doing movies and stuff. And they managed to, again, that is the thing, a little bit of the thing that we were like talking about. Like Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons are not going to like give up.
That's the truth.
Probably there's an element of that, doggedness, and maybe delusion, but like maybe delusion and doggedness gets you through the 80s. They just they just didn't stop. And like, it's not like really people were going around thinking that they were cool, but they would still go out and play arenas.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's amazing. And Priest, I don't really understand. I need to really study more how Priest made it through. Because there are these bands like from the early 80s. Like when you look at, have you seen the Hearing Aid video recently?
Yes, and I was going to bring that up, strangely.
Because first of all, if you have not watched the Dio documentary.
Oh, we just did a few weeks ago, and it's amazing.
It's amazing. And because when Dio produced it, they got all the music, like they got the syncs.
Yes.
Waved. So there's actually great music. But, when you look at that thing and it's like some of those people didn't make it. Like the early 80s people really didn't make it. I mean, that's why Spinal Tap is so prescient. Like it's this band in 1983 of guys, what are they, 35 then, you know?
Yeah.
But like, and it's about this band trying to pivot
Yeah.
into this new world. I don't know. We wanted to do a lot more of that. We had a whole storyline of this, of like bands, or the earlier bands that somehow made it through. And it just we didn't get the access and we didn't have the space. So it just didn't.
So basically this needs to be 3 books. So that will be your second book. And then Into Thin Hair will be the third book.
Trilogy.
There you go, trilogy.
Our second book, we actually just blew our first deadline, is we totally did a 180. We're doing Lollapalooza 91 to 97.
Oh, nice. That's going to be awesome.
We're just like, that was like we were just like, we moved out of it. But this one, Paramount Plus just bought it. So it will be a 3-part documentary.
Holy shit, that's fantastic.
Great.
So that'll be, so we're going to get to, I think, go back and interview like a lot of these people.
So Tom, what you're saying is Rich might finally get his wish and Paramount might interview Blackie.
Yes. And Blackie sort of reemerged too. So like, it is possible. I wish it for him.
I did want to touch on the Hearing Aid video because that ties into why I was talking about Dio before we recorded, because my understanding is Dio hung out on the Sunset Strip and he was kind of like a mentor figure almost to some of these kids as they were coming up and becoming these bands. And you kind of see that. You watch the Hearing Aid video and you see members of Motley Crue in there. You see Blackie in there. You've got Dave Meniketti and Paul Shortino and all of these guys playing on this record. But he didn't really pivot into the scene himself. So it's like he gave them all kind of a push in the right direction, but then stepped back. And I always thought that was kind of interesting.
I think it was a thematic issue too. Like, you know, that's the thing is like if Van Halen is the template for 80s glam metal, it's like Zero Dragons. Like there's no, like that's the whole thing, you know, like it's just like, no, like it's partying, not slaying.
And so, I think that's part of why I struggled with the scene as a teenager was the lack of dragons.
There you go. Right, yeah. Makes sense.
There's no dragons in glam metal. You know, that should have been the title, No Dragons.
I love it. Yes.
But I think that his iconography was like not current, you know?
That's very true. Yeah. It didn't really fit what else was going on.
I didn't get to ask you this before, so I wanted to sort of wait till the end when we got this all out of our system. I wanted to ask about producing Guided by Voices and the fun of navigating Bob Pollard through a record.
I did not produce a whole Guided by Voices record.
Okay.
I mixed a record for him, but it's funny, the way that they do the records now is wild. Because he just stays in Ohio and they bring him, you know, the music and he sings over it. I have recorded Doug Gillard and produced stuff for him and mixed Guided by Voices, but he would just crush me like a fly, dude. Yeah. Bob Pollard would destroy me. I love Guided by Voices.
I was going to say you held up very well from that experience.
No, I would be like, you know, he's like a real tall, grumpy, gruff American man. And I would just turn to, I would be like, poof. He'd be like, why the fuck do you want me to do that? And
I was going to say, man, that is
going to go home now.
I was going to say, for somebody who got through working with Guided by Voices, you sure look like you're fine. So yeah.
No, Paul Stanley's son broke me. I mean,
wow.
That's sad.
You know, around that time, my big dream was to be a rock star, of course, like every kid. I am certain I would not have made it on that scene. I just don't have what any of those people had that they lived through existing on the strip and all that kind of stuff. I would never have made it. I just don't have the hedonistic streak in me, and I don't have Those boys would have eaten me alive. That's what I'm saying.
I mean, it's a weird psychographic, right? I mean, you have to, like, there's that, and we did track him down. Matt Smith, the original guitar player of Poison, he goes out to LA.
Yeah.
And he's like, I can't, his girlfriend was pregnant, but and so he says, like, that's why he went back. But look, there's a lot of dudes who didn't go back, right? But
yeah,
he couldn't take it. Like, and you know what? That makes him the sane one.
Yeah.
I'm living in a warehouse with cockroaches flying around, people trying to kick my ass every time I walk outside of here. I'm eating like ketchup,
exactly.
And like,
yeah, it's okay to not want that.
Yeah. And it's just like, what like that would break most people.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
But
what were you going to say, Tom? Because you were going to say one more thing. You said.
Oh, so this is and again, here's another person who's like sort of on the edge of cancellation. But I have a friend who's good friends with Phil Anselmo from Pantera, the newly and he was talking about how his band Down was touring, opening for Dio, for Heaven and Hell, which was the Dio fronted Black Sabbath. And he said that he would watch Dio from the side of the stage and that Dio's voice was so loud, like you didn't even need the monitors. And that he went up to Dio at the hotel bar one night and he's like, dude, you blew me away tonight. You're so good. And he goes, thanks. And I'm going to do it tomorrow night too. And he walked away.
That is hilarious. Well, Tom, thank you so much once again for spending this time with us and talking about your book. One last time, do a little spiel for it. Anybody who hasn't bought it yet, they should go out and get it. So tell them about it.
Our book is called Nothin But a Good Time, and it's the uncensored history of the 80s hard rock explosion, which actually means hair metal or glam metal, but we didn't want to put that on the cover. And it really, like, if on my best days when I'm feeling really good about it, it is sort of the first in-depth look at this music, and it's all in the voices of the people who were there. So if you ever wanted to fantasize that you were like at a dinner table with all four members of Cinderella telling you how their career went, or Warrant, or one of these bands, you can sit by the book and pretend that that's happening. It's really in their voices. It's really like interesting details you haven't heard before, and written with love and lots of hand wringing and panicking.
And one great thing about you can pick this book up and read it as a whole book, but you can also, if you just turn to a chapter, you can read the chapter and just be like, okay, I'm entertained, and I'm going to just put the book down. You know what I mean? Like, it's like you can go back and forth and just little vignettes if you want. At this,
they're bathroom sized chapters.
Exactly, is what I'm saying.
That's a good way to put that.
I just wanted to like really lay it out clearly.
That's what I meant. Anyway.
Yeah. I didn't want to say I read a chapter at a time on the crapper, but you put it very much nicer
That's
than
the
I
preferred method.
This is the best way to end this interview ever.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Tom, thanks again for hanging out with us. Everybody should go and pick up the book. It is so much fun. It's eye-opening, and it's fantastic.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
So thanks, and we'll let you get on with the rest of your evening. Take care, buddy.
There's some eggplant parm in my very near future.
Nice.
Yay,
Nice.
Tom, I'll talk to
All
you
right, see you later. Thanks so much.
Okay. Well, so that was a great interview with Tom, but we're going to take a real quick break here, throw in a 30-second ad. We're going to be right back with some more stuff. So see you in just a minute.
You know what now is a good time for? It's time for a promo for the Cosmic Pizza Podcast.
The Cosmic Pizza Podcast, you say?
That sounds delicious. What is that?
It's a delicious slice of life.
In every episode?
In every episode, where we talk about conspiracy theories,
Cartoons of our childhood,
Star Trek quizzes?
movies that we've liked.
pod racing, general pop culture,
Fantasy recasts?
But what we don't talk about is pizzas.
right here on the ESO Network.
All right, we are back, and we have some listener feedback. Steph, you want to share what you got?
Yes, our 1973 episode got a lot of comments from all of our social media platforms. So Steph Ramona Randall said some of her favorites were Angie from the Stones, We're an American Band from GFR, Tie a Yellow Ribbon from Tony Orlando and Dawn, and she said whatever was on her K-Tel album. Karen Carluccio says, I've been singing this song for a week now. Someone planted an earworm, but I don't mind. One of my favorite songs, Elton John's Blues for Baby and Me. Frank Lima says, the Kinks Preservation Act, one from 1973, was one of a handful of life-changing albums to this day. So let's see. Alan Katz, one of his favorites is Jethro Tull. Alan Davis says, I like Leonard Skinner from that age, but I'm an 80s, 90s child. Also Buffalo Springfield, Pink Floyd, and The Doors. Tom Mellon, I hope I'm saying this right. Tom Mellon-Zane says, Elton John and Bernie Taupin in the 70s were absolute geniuses, close to magic as possible. And we had a very beautiful and lovely general comment from Matthew Fernandez on Facebook, who said, fantastic podcast. Thought I knew a lot about music. Apparently not.
Oh,
thank you, Matthew.
I love that. I learn stuff from you three all the time. So, no matter how much you think you know, there's always more stuff to learn. And that's been one of the great things about doing this podcast is that I think I know a lot of shit about music, but I also know there's a ton that I don't know and that I love learning about.
Yes, I feel the same way about you guys. You guys are like encyclopedias of music, so it's cool.
I'm more of a thesaurus of music. I don't even know what that means, but all right, so that's it for this week. We will be back next week, and we've got some special guests lined up for that too. Stephanie, why don't you tell us who we have coming in?
We've got Joanna Spockdean and Teresa Kariakis, and we're going to be talking about the genesis of the LA punk scene. It's going to be so awesome.
Oh, it's going to be great. All right, so I hope you'll join us again next week. Everybody take care. See you soon. Keep rocking on.
This has been a broadcast of the ESO Network. Be part of the crew and help support our shows by donating to our ESO Patreon or by shopping at the TeePublic store, which can all be found at www.esonetwork.com. The ESO Network, your station for all things geek.